In the Soviet Union, normal was not a synonym for safe, reasonable, or even voluntary. It was a synonym for required, expected, unavoidable. For more than 7 decades, from the Bolshevik seizure of power in Petrograd in October 1917 to the red flag coming down over the Kremlin in December 1991, tens of millions of people lived inside a system that tried to redesign reality itself. The economy, the family, the calendar, the map, the past, the future, even the language people used to describe what they saw with their own eyes. Outsiders often remember the Soviet story through a few iconic images: Stalin's mustache, Sputnik's beep, the Berlin Wall, the mushroom cloud. But the Soviet experience was also built from 1,000 daily rituals and absurdities that were so common they stopped being questioned. This is the anatomy of that normal, 100 crazy things that were treated as ordinary, routine, patriotic, or simply inevitable, and how they came to be. It started with the idea that the state could replace the market overnight and that coercion could substitute for price and profit. In 1918, amid civil war and collapse, the Bolsheviks launched war communism, a policy regime that made it normal for armed detachments to requisition grain from peasants, for private trade to be banned, and for ration cards to decide who ate and who starved. The cause was immediate survival and ideological conviction. Lenin's government believed the revolution could not be defended without total control of food and industry. The consequence was predictable: production crashed, peasants hid grain, cities emptied, and famines spread. By 1921, the Volga region was in catastrophe, and the Soviet state created in the name of the workers was forced to accept foreign relief, including the American Relief Administration led by Herbert Hoover, to feed millions. Yet the lesson the system absorbed was not humility. It was that emergency methods could become habits. From there, it became normal for the police to be political and politics to be policed. The Cheka, created in December 1917 under Felix Dzerzhinsky, was not a conventional security service. It was an instrument of revolutionary terror. Arrest without warrant, detention without trial, execution by administrative order — these were not deviations, but tools. During the Red Terror announced in 1918, hostages, summary shootings, and mass arrests were used as state policy. The Soviet state did not merely punish crime, it punished identity, class background, and suspected thoughts. That set the template for later organs: the OGPU, NKVD, MGB, and finally, the KGB, each inheriting the assumption that the regime's survival depended on preemptive repression. It became normal to rewrite the calendar and the very structure of time. In the late 1920s and early 1930s, the USSR experimented with new workweek systems, including the Neporivka, a continuous production schedule introduced in 1929 that replaced the traditional 7-day week with a 5-day cycle, then a 6-day cycle, in an attempt to keep factories running non-stop and weaken religious observance. Families found themselves with different rest days, making it difficult to gather, attend church, or even see each other. The cause was industrial urgency and anti-religious ideology. The consequence was social disorientation so severe that the state retreated to a more conventional 7-day week by 1940. But for a decade, it was normal to live in a country that tried to abolish Sunday. It became normal for the state to wage war on faith with bureaucratic precision. The League of the Militant Godless, founded in 1925, organized anti-religious campaigns, lectures, and publications. Churches were closed, priests arrested, religious education restricted. By the late 1930s, thousands of clergy had been shot or sent to labor camps. This was not merely a cultural shift, it was a state project. The cause was Marxist-Leninist doctrine viewing religion as a rival authority and opiate, combined with the desire to seize church property and break local loyalties. The consequence was a deep, lasting underground religiosity and a cynicism toward official truth, because people learned early that the state could declare their most intimate beliefs illegal. It became normal for housing to be collectivized, not by choice, but by shortage and decree. The communal apartments carved out of pre-revolutionary, flat-sterned private life into a shared performance. Several families might share a kitchen, bathroom, corridor, and telephone, with walls thin enough to transmit every argument and every whisper. The cause was urbanization, destruction, and the state's prioritization of industry over living space. The consequence was a culture of surveillance that didn't require microphones. It required only neighbors, queues for the stove, and disputes over whose turn it was to use the sink. In a communalca, privacy was not a right, it was a luxury. It became normal to treat denunciation as civic duty. In the 1930s, especially during the Great Terror of 1937-1938, the system encouraged citizens to report wreckers, saboteurs, spies, and enemies of the people. The NKVD's Order No. 447, issued on 30 July 1937, set quotas for arrests and executions of anti-Soviet elements. Quotas turned paranoia into arithmetic. The cause was Stalin's drive to eliminate real and imagined opposition and to discipline society through fear. The consequence was a self-fueling machine. Denunciations created arrests, arrests created confessions under torture, confessions justified more arrests. Between 1937 and 1938, roughly 1.5 million people were arrested in political operations, and about 681,000 were executed, according to later archival research. In that environment, it was normal to fear the doorbell at night. It became normal for show trials to replace evidence. The Moscow trials of 1936, 1937, and 1938 staged prosecutions of former Bolshevik leaders like Grigory Zinoviev, Lev Kamenev, and Nikolai Bukharin were public rituals of confession and condemnation. The cause was Stalin's need to legitimize purges by portraying them as defense against treason. The consequence was the destruction of the old revolutionary elite and a warning to everyone else. Loyalty was not enough. Survival required invisibility. It became normal for entire peoples to be punished collectively. During World War II, Stalin authorized mass deportations of ethnic groups accused of collaboration. The Crimean Tatars were deported in May 1944, Chechens and Ingush in February 1944, Volga Germans earlier, beginning in 1941. Families were loaded into cattle cars and sent to Central Asia under NKVD guard. The cause was wartime paranoia and the regime's readiness to use demographic engineering as security policy. The consequence was death on a vast scale from hunger, disease, and exposure, and a legacy of trauma and grievance that did not disappear with Stalin's death. It became normal to treat the labor camp system as an economic institution. The Gulag was not a metaphor. It was an archipelago of camps administered by the NKVD and later the MVD, supplying forced labor to mines, railways, canals, and forests. Projects like the White Sea-Baltic Canal, built in 1931-1933, became propaganda triumphs despite catastrophic human cost. The cause was the state's demand for rapid industrialization and its belief that human beings could be used like fuel. The consequence was a brutal labor economy that shaped entire regions. Kolyma, Vorkuta, Norilsk Square cities and industries were built on prisoner labor and mass grave. It became normal for famine to be denied while it happened. The famine of 1932-1933, including the catastrophe in Soviet Ukraine known as the Holodomor, occurred amid forced collectivization and grain requisitioning. Peasants were stripped of food, livestock, and seed grain. Internal passports and travel restrictions trapped many in starving villages. The cause was Stalin's collectivization drive, ideological hostility to the peasantry, and the state's insistence on grain exports and urban supply. The consequence was millions of deaths. Scholars debate exact numbers, but the scale is indisputable and a silence enforced by censorship and fear. In a system where the state claimed to embody the people, it became normal to pretend the people were not dying. It became normal to equate criticism with sabotage. Engineers and specialists were periodically accused of wrecking, as in the Shakti trial of 1928, where mining engineers were charged with deliberately harming production. The cause was a political need to explain failures of planning and impossible targets. The consequence was that expertise became dangerous. People learned that truth about shortages, errors, and broken machinery could be interpreted as disloyalty. It became normal to set production targets that ignored physics. The 5-year plans, beginning in 1928, demanded enormous increases in coal, steel, electricity, and machine production. Targets were often inflated, revised, and politically charged. The cause was the leadership's obsession with catching up to industrial powers and preparing for war. The consequence was chronic falsification. What Soviets called propiskue managers reported imaginary output to satisfy the plan. This created a double reality, official triumph and private breakdown. It became normal for propaganda to be the air people breathed. Newspapers like Pravda, posters, parades, films, and radio all reinforced the narrative of socialist progress and capitalist decay. The cause was a one-party state that required ideological unity. The consequence was not simply belief, it was a split consciousness. People learned to repeat slogans in public and speak differently in kitchens, creating a culture where the private sphere became the last refuge of honesty. It became normal for children to be organized like a reserve army of ideology. The Young Pioneers, founded in 1922, and the Komsomol, the Communist Youth League, shaped education and social life. Uniforms, oaths, and collective activities were designed to create the new Soviet person. The cause was the regime's understanding that the future depended on controlling the young. The consequence was a generational experience where belonging and opportunity were tied to participation, and refusal could mean exclusion from education and careers. It became normal for the family itself to be a political battleground. Early Soviet policy experimented with liberal divorce laws and promoted women's participation in labor, while later Stalinist policy reversed course, tightening divorce in 1936 and promoting traditional family values to stabilize society. The cause was the tension between revolutionary social engineering and the need for demographic growth and order. The consequence was that intimate life could swing with the party line. The state could decide whether motherhood was liberation, duty, or both. It became normal for abortion policy to change with the state's needs. The USSR legalized abortion in 1920, banned it in 1936 under Stalin to raise birth rates, and legalized it again in 1955 after Stalin's death. The cause was demographic policy and ideological framing of women's roles. The consequence was a medical and social whiplash. Women's bodies became instruments of state planning, and unsafe procedures flourished during Prohibition. It became normal for people to live under internal passport controls. The internal passport system, introduced in 1932, tied citizens to their place of residence through the Propiska registration system. Peasants were often denied passports, restricting movement to cities. The cause was the state's desire to control urbanization, labor allocation, and socially alien elements. The consequence was a society where moving, renting, or even visiting could become a bureaucratic ordeal, and where freedom of movement taken for granted elsewhere was an administrative privilege. It became normal to wait. Queuing was not a temporary inconvenience, but a feature of the planned economy. Lines for bread, meat, shoes, furniture, or even toilet paper became part of daily strategy. The cause was chronic shortages created by price controls, misallocation, and the absence of market signals. The consequence was a parallel economy of favors, connections, and barter, what Russians called blatware, knowing the right person mattered as much as money. It became normal to treat foreign goods like contraband treasure. Scarcity and closed borders made imported jeans, records, and electronic symbols of freedom and status. In the 1950s and 1960s, Styliagi youth adopted Western fashion and jazz, often harassed by authorities. The cause was cultural isolation and ideological hostility to bourgeois influence. The consequence was that consumer items became political statements and culture became a battlefield. It became normal for the state to jam radio signals. Western broadcasts such as the BBC, Voice of America, and Radio Free Europe were jammed for decades. The cause was fear that alternative information could undermine legitimacy. The consequence was a cat-and-mouse culture of listening at night, adjusting antennas, and whispering about what was heard. The state's insistence on controlling truth revealed its insecurity. It became normal to live with censorship so extensive that even maps could be classified. Soviet cartography often omitted details or falsified coordinates for security. Certain cities, especially those tied to defense and nuclear industries, were closed, sometimes absent from public maps. The cause was military secrecy in a Cold War environment. The consequence was a population that could live near major installations without officially knowing what they were, while entire communities existed behind checkpoints. It became normal for closed cities to be both privileged and imprisoned. Places like Arzamas 16, later known as Sarov, were central to the Soviet nuclear program. Residents had better supplies but limited freedom to leave, and their very addresses were disguised. The cause was the priority of strategic weapons and fear of espionage. The consequence was a caste-like geography. Some citizens lived in abundance behind fences, while others endured scarcity in open cities. It became normal for the state to use psychiatry as a political weapon. From the 1960s onward, dissidents could be diagnosed with sluggish schizophrenia and confined to psychiatric hospitals, a practice documented by activists and later investigated. The cause was a desire to neutralize opposition without the spectacle of political trials, framing dissent as illness. The consequence was a chilling message. To disagree was not merely criminal, it was pathological. It became normal for writers and scientists to be monitored, censored, or exiled internally. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, whose works exposed the Gulag, was expelled from the USSR in 1974 after years of harassment. Andrei Sakharov, the physicist who helped develop the hydrogen bomb, became a human rights advocate and was exiled to Gorky, now Nizhny Novgorod, in 1980. The cause was the regime's fear of influential voices. The consequence was a moral paradox. The state that celebrated intellect also feared it. It became normal for the USSR to present itself as anti-imperialist while maintaining an empire of its own. After World War II, Soviet power expanded across Eastern Europe. Communist regimes were installed or consolidated in Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria, backed by Soviet troops and security services. The cause was strategic depth after the devastation of the Nazi invasion and ideological ambition. The consequence was a bloc held together by force and dependency, where sovereignty was conditional. It became normal for tanks to decide political debates. In Hungary, in 1956, a popular uprising against Soviet domination was crushed by Soviet military intervention in November, with thousands killed and many more arrested or forced into exile. In Czechoslovakia, in August 1968, the Prague Spring reforms under Alexander Dubček were ended by Warsaw Pact troops. The cause was the Brezhnev Doctrine, the idea that socialist countries had limited sovereignty if socialism itself was threatened. The consequence was a lasting cynicism across Eastern Europe and a message to Soviet citizens: reform had boundaries enforced by armor. It became normal for the KGB to be everywhere and nowhere at once. Formed in 1954, the KGB maintained domestic surveillance, foreign intelligence, and border security. Informants were recruited in workplaces and universities. The cause was a political system that equated stability with control of information. The consequence was self-censorship as a survival skill and a society where trust could be dangerous. It became normal for the state to celebrate voluntary labor that was not truly voluntary. Subbotnik's unpaid Saturday labor days began in 1919 as a revolutionary practice and persisted as a civic ritual. The cause was chronic labor needs and ideological emphasis on collective sacrifice. The consequence was a blurred line between civic contribution and coercion, where participation was expected and refusal could be noted. It became normal for mass mobilization to be staged as celebration. May Day parades and October Revolution anniversaries were choreographed displays of unity, with banners, portraits of leaders, and rehearsed slogans. The cause was the need to demonstrate legitimacy and strength. The consequence was a politics of spectacle, where public enthusiasm mattered less than public appearance. It became normal for history to be rewritten in real time. Under Stalin, photographs were altered to remove purged figures, textbooks were revised, yesterday's hero could become today's traitor. The cause was the consolidation of personal power and control of narrative. The consequence was a population trained to distrust official memory and to treat truth as temporary. It became normal for people to fear their own biography, social origin being from a kulak family, a priest's family, or having relatives abroad could damage careers and invite scrutiny. The cause was class warfare ideology and security paranoia. The consequence was that people lied about their past, cut ties with relatives, and learned to navigate life as a file in an archive. It became normal for the state to attempt to replace religion with political ritual. Lenin's mausoleum, built after his death in January 1924, became a shrine of state. The cause was the need for a unifying symbol and a sacred center for a secular ideology. The consequence was a quasi-religious reverence for leaders, with pilgrimages and ceremonies that echoed what the regime claimed to abolish. It became normal for industrial disasters to be hidden. The Kyshtym disaster of 1957 at the Mayak nuclear facility in the Chelyabinsk region released massive radioactive contamination, one of the worst nuclear accidents in history, yet it was kept secret for decades. The cause was Cold War secrecy and the priority of the nuclear program. The consequence was long-term health and environmental damage, and a culture where citizens could be harmed without being told why. It became normal for environmental destruction to be treated as progress. The diversion of rivers feeding the Aral Sea, driven by cotton irrigation policies in Central Asia, accelerated from the 1960s onward. The sea shrank dramatically, salinity rose, fisheries collapsed, and toxic dust storms spread. The cause was central planning focused on production quotas and export goals. The consequence was one of the world's worst man-made ecological disasters, still shaping lives in Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan today. It became normal for the state to gamble with nuclear technology under conditions that prioritized output over transparency. The Chernobyl disaster on 26 April 1986, at reactor number 4 of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant near Pripyat in the Ukrainian USSR, exposed the lethal intersection of flawed reactor design, dangerous testing protocols, and a culture of secrecy. The cause was a system that rewarded meeting targets and discouraged reporting problems. The consequence was immediate deaths among plant workers and firefighters, massive radioactive release across Europe, the evacuation of over 100,000 people from the exclusion zone, and a profound blow to Soviet legitimacy. It also accelerated Mikhail Gorbachev's push for glasnost, because the old reflex to hide reality became impossible in the age of international monitoring. It became normal for soldiers to be treated as expendable in peacetime and wartime alike. During World War II, the USSR suffered staggering losses, often estimated around 27 million dead, military and civilian combined. Some of that was the result of the Nazi war of annihilation. Some was the result of Soviet decisions, rushed offensives, harsh discipline, and penal units. Order number 227, issued on 28 July 1942, not one step back, created blocking detachments and penal battalions. The cause was desperation during the German advance and Stalin's insistence on discipline. The consequence was a brutalization of military culture and the normalization of extreme coercion as a tool of survival. It became normal for prisoners to be sent to the front. Penal battalions, composed of soldiers convicted of offenses, were used for the most dangerous missions. The cause was a punitive approach to discipline and a need for manpower. The consequence was that redemption was measured in blood, and the line between justice and utility dissolved. It became normal for victory to be both sacred and controlled. After 1945, the Great Patriotic War became the foundational myth of Soviet legitimacy. Monuments rose, ceremonies expanded, and the narrative emphasized unity and heroism while downplaying Soviet mistakes and the early collaboration between Nazi Germany and the USSR under the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of August 1939. The cause was the need for a unifying story after immense suffering. The consequence was a memory politics that still echoes today, where the war's meaning is contested and weaponized. It became normal for borders to be redrawn by secret protocols. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact included secret agreements dividing Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. In September 1939, the USSR invaded eastern Poland after Germany attacked from the west. The Baltic states were later occupied and annexed in 1940. The cause was Stalin's attempt to buy time and regain territories lost after World War I. The consequence was mass repression in annexed regions and a legacy of distrust that shaped post-Soviet politics. It became normal for mass executions to be denied for decades. In 1940, the NKVD executed thousands of Polish officers and intelligentsia in the Katyn Forest and other sites. The Soviet government blamed Nazi Germany until 1990, when official admission was made under Gorbachev. The cause was Stalin's elimination of potential opposition in occupied Poland and the regime's obsession with controlling narrative. The consequence was a wound in Polish-Soviet relations and a symbol of how state lies could persist across generations. It became normal for the economy to produce rockets and tanks while failing to provide soap. The Soviet model achieved real feats: rapid industrialization, victory in World War II, nuclear parity, space achievements, but it also systematically underprovided consumer goods. The cause was prioritization of heavy industry and defense, reinforced by planning incentives. The consequence was a daily life of improvisation, repair, and substitution, where people became experts at making do. It became normal for people to build private survival networks inside a collective system. The informal exchange of favors was a rational response to irrational distribution. The cause was shortage and bureaucratic gatekeeping. The consequence was corruption, not as a moral failure of individuals, but as a structural adaptation, undermining faith in official equality. It became normal for official equality to coexist with privileged elites. The nomenclatura party and state officials had access to special stores, better housing, sanatoriums, and dachas. The cause was the need to reward loyalty and maintain administrative control. The consequence was hypocrisy embedded into governance, a classless society with a class that insisted it did not exist. It became normal for travel abroad to be rare and controlled. Exit visas, invitations, and KGB vetting limited foreign travel. The cause was fear of defections and exposure to alternative realities. The consequence was isolation and myth-making. The West became both demonized and idealized because direct experience was scarce. It became normal for the state to police art. Socialist realism, declared the official style in the 1930s, demanded optimistic portrayals of Soviet life. Avant-garde experimentation was suppressed. Artists could be marginalized or arrested. The cause was ideological control and the desire for accessible propaganda. The consequence was a cultural landscape where innovation often moved underground and conformity became a survival strategy. It became normal for jokes to be dangerous. Political humor flourished, but telling the wrong joke to the wrong person could bring trouble, especially under Stalin. The cause was the criminalization of anti-Soviet agitation. The consequence was a culture where laughter was both resistance and risk, and where the kitchen table became a stage for whispered truth. It became normal for newspapers to report record harvests while shelves were empty. This disconnect was not accidental, it was systemic. The cause was that plan fulfillment mattered more than reality, and propaganda mattered more than accountability. The consequence was a population trained to read between the lines, to interpret what was omitted as much as what was printed. It became normal for science to be politicized. The rise of Trofim Lysenko, who rejected Mendelian genetics and promoted flawed agricultural theories, was backed by Stalin and dominated Soviet biology from the late 1930s into the 1950s. Geneticists were fired, arrested, or silenced. The cause was ideological hostility to bourgeois science and the attraction of promises for quick results. The consequence was damage to Soviet biology and agriculture, and a warning that even nature could be ordered to obey doctrine. It became normal for the state to move entire industries eastward under invasion. When Germany invaded in June 1941, the USSR evacuated thousands of factories beyond the Urals. The cause was existential threat and massive logistical mobilization. The consequence was a wartime industrial miracle achieved through extreme sacrifice, reshaping Soviet geography and creating industrial centers in Siberia and Central Asia. It became normal for women to carry double burdens. Soviet ideology promoted women's employment, and women entered industry, science, and medicine in large numbers, but domestic labor remained largely theirs. The cause was both emancipatory policy and economic necessity. The consequence was a society where equality often meant working full-time and then standing in queues and managing the household. It became normal for alcohol to be both a social glue and a state revenue source. Vodka sales were a major source of state income, and heavy drinking became widespread. The cause was cultural tradition, stress, and state reliance on alcohol revenue. The consequence was public health damage and reduced productivity, issues that later drove Gorbachev's anti-alcohol campaign in 1985, which itself had consequences: black market production, public resentment, and lost state revenue. It became normal for the Soviet Union to build walls without always calling them walls. The Berlin Wall, erected in August 1961 by East Germany with Soviet backing, was the most visible symbol of the bloc's fear of emigration. The cause was the hemorrhaging of East German citizens to the West and the political embarrassment it caused. The consequence was a physical manifestation of ideological failure. If socialism was superior, it should not need concrete and guards to keep people in. It became normal for the USSR to compete in space while struggling on Earth. Sputnik launched on 4 October 1957. Yuri Gagarin orbited on 12 April 1961. These were genuine achievements of engineering and organization. The cause was Cold War competition and the strategic value of missile technology. The consequence was global prestige and domestic pride, but also a diversion of resources toward prestige projects while housing and consumer needs lagged. It became normal for military secrecy to shape civilian life. Many Soviet men served in strategic rocket forces or secret facilities. Families lived with silence about where they were stationed. The cause was Cold War paranoia and genuine intelligence threats. The consequence was a society accustomed to not asking questions, because questions could be interpreted as curiosity and curiosity as disloyalty. It became normal for Afghanistan to become a wound. In December 1979, Soviet troops entered Afghanistan to support the communist government. The war dragged on until 1989. The cause was fear of losing influence on the southern border and the desire to stabilize a friendly regime. The consequence was tens of thousands of Soviet casualties, a demoralized army, international condemnation, and a generation of veterans who returned to a society that often did not want to hear about the war. It also fueled Islamist militancy and became a key chapter in Cold War escalation. It became normal for the state to claim moral superiority while using disinformation abroad. Soviet active measures included propaganda and influence operations, documented in various Cold War studies and archives. The cause was geopolitical competition with the United States and NATO. The consequence was a global information war whose methods did not vanish with the USSR, they evolved. It became normal for the Soviet economy to be second in the world while failing at basics. By many metrics, the USSR was a superpower with massive industrial output and military capacity, yet it struggled to provide consistent food quality, pharmaceuticals, and infrastructure maintenance. The cause was the structural inefficiency of central planning, lack of feedback, and political fear of admitting failure. The consequence was stagnation, especially in the Brezhnev era, when growth slowed and the system relied on oil revenues and inertia. It became normal for disaster response to be shaped by image management. When the Soviet passenger ship Admiral Nakhimov sank in the Black Sea near Novorossiysk on 31 August 1986, killing hundreds, the tragedy occurred in a society still reeling from Chernobyl months earlier. The cause of such maritime disasters was complex human error, safety standards, enforcement, but what made them Soviet normal was the instinct to control information and minimize scandal. The consequence was public distrust. People assumed the worst because the state often told them less than the truth. It became normal for ordinary citizens to become amateur mechanics. Soviet products were often durable but inconsistent, and spare parts could be scarce. People repaired cars like the Lada and Moskvich with improvised tools and networks of parts. The cause was shortage and limited consumer service infrastructure. The consequence was a culture of ingenuity, but also a quiet admission that the system could not reliably provide what it promised. It became normal for the black market to coexist with official ideology. From illegal currency trading to underground manufacturing, the second economy grew. The cause was unmet demand and rigid controls. The consequence was corruption, inequality, and an erosion of belief in the official system because, when everyone breaks the rules to survive, the rules lose legitimacy. It became normal for the party to be everywhere in the workplace. Party committees influenced promotions, discipline, and policy. The cause was the one-party state's need to control institutions. The consequence was that competence could be secondary to loyalty and that workplaces became political arenas. It became normal for the state to keep statistics secret. Data on crime, disease, industrial accidents, and even demographics could be restricted. The cause was the fear that bad numbers would weaken legitimacy. The consequence was policy blindness. Problems could not be solved openly if they could not be named. It became normal for people to live with the memory of purges even after the purges ended. After Stalin's death in March 1953, Nikita Khrushchev denounced Stalin's crimes in his secret speech on 25 February 1956. Many prisoners were released and rehabilitated. The cause was a struggle for power and a recognition that terror had become unsustainable. The consequence was a partial thaw, but also a deep ambiguity. The state admitted some crimes while preserving the system that enabled them. The fear did not disappear, it changed shape. It became normal for reform to be both promised and constrained. Gorbachev's perestroika and glasnost in the mid-1980s opened space for debate and criticism. The cause was economic crisis and the recognition that stagnation was fatal. The consequence was an unraveling. Once censorship loosened, suppressed histories and grievances erupted. National movements in the Baltic republics and elsewhere gained momentum. The Soviet Union, built on enforced unity, discovered that truth had centrifugal force. It became normal for the center to lose control in real time. In August 1991, hardliners attempted a coup against Gorbachev. The coup failed, accelerated the collapse of the Communist Party's authority, and empowered Republican leaders like Boris Yeltsin in the Russian SFSR. The cause was fear of losing the Union and privileges. The consequence was the final disintegration. By December 1991, the USSR ceased to exist. Now step back and look at the deeper pattern behind these crazy normal practices. They were not isolated quirks. They formed an ecosystem. A command economy made shortages normal, and shortages made queues normal, and queues made favors normal, and favors made corruption normal. Political monopoly made censorship normal, and censorship made rumor normal, and rumor made paranoia normal, and paranoia made surveillance normal. Ideological certainty made dissent abnormal, and that made prisons, camps, deportations, and psychiatric abuse normal. Secrecy made disasters normal, because when accountability is dangerous, prevention becomes optional. And the constant mobilization for warrior war, feared war, ideological war made sacrifice normal, until sacrifice became the only language the state knew. The Soviet Union was capable of extraordinary achievements, and it paid for them in extraordinary ways. It defeated Nazi Germany at a cost almost unimaginable. It industrialized a vast territory. It built a scientific and military machine that forced the world to treat it as an equal. But it also normalized coercion as a management style, normalized lies as a governance tool, and normalized the reduction of human beings to inputs in a plan. When a system trains its citizens to survive by improvisation, silence, and doublethink, it creates habits that outlive the system itself. The modern consequences are not confined to nostalgia or condemnation. They are structural and psychological. Post-Soviet states inherited infrastructures built for secrecy, bureaucracies trained to obey rather than explain, and publics trained to distrust official truth. The memory of war and repression still shapes politics, identity, and foreign policy. The environmental scars from the Aral Sea to nuclear contamination remain physical reminders that ideology does not repeal ecology. And the information habits of the Cold War propaganda, jamming, disinformation did not vanish. They adapted to new technologies and new audiences. The takeaway is not that Soviet people were strange or that suffering was uniquely theirs. The takeaway is that when a state claims the right to define reality, it will eventually demand that citizens live inside contradictions as if they are laws of nature. In the Soviet Union, 100 crazy things were considered normal because the system made normality a political decision. And that is the most dangerous kind of normal because, once a society accepts it, the extraordinary becomes routine, the unacceptable becomes daily life, and the line between survival and complicity becomes the hardest border of all.